In this slideshow, we're going to discuss the early stages of blackface minstrelsy in the U.S. I'm thinking specifically of the first two eras of blackface minstrelsy. The first one stretches roughly from the end of the 1820s, with the first blackface performers such as Dixon and Rice, through 1843, and we'll talk about why 1843 is an important date further on. And then the second era stretches from roughly 1843 through the Civil War, so 1865 or so. As you can see from the title, I'm calling this presentation Minstrelsy and Structures of Racial Feeling, and that should indicate where I'm heading with this. I'm interested in what it is that blackface minstrelsy accomplishes. It's easy to dismiss minstrelsy as a kind of wicked and more or less pointless part of our racist past in this country, but I think it's important to go back and think about what it is that minstrelsy accomplished for people in the 1820s, 30s, and forward. This is important because the 1820s and 1830s were a pivotal moment in race relations in the U.S. We tend to think of racism in the U.S. as basically dividing along the Mason-Dixon line, where the North was inherently better, not without racism, but inherently better as far as racial relations are concerned than the South. Actually, what we're dealing with is a stratification that's at least tripartite, if not more. So instead of a mildly racist North and a bitterly racist South, we really have the North, where to some people's minds from the time, racism was worse in the North, and we have to ask ourselves, why would that be? Why is it that people, whether or not we agree that that's the case, since obviously in the South slavery was more concentrated, people at the time often made this remark, and we might want to ask ourselves why it was that way. The other thing that people often forget is you have the middle states, the what is sometimes called the Upper South, Maryland and Delaware and so on. And this was tobacco country, and by the 1820s there was less of a concentration of slaves for tobacco farms. More and more of the slaves were concentrated on the large plantations in the Deep South that dealt with cotton. So the way in which slavery operated changes quite a bit in the 1820s, and therefore the relationship among whites and free blacks and also enslaved blacks changed quite a bit. So the question here is, what is it that minstrelsy tells us about the attempts of people in the 1820s, 30s, 40s to come to grips with the black other? So we're questioning what kind of social and cultural work minstrelsy did in the 1830s through 1865. How did it navigate the simultaneous disdain and attraction whites felt for blacks? And this is an important point here. Again, it's easy to oversimplify the way that racism works. It's easy to say that it's unidirectional, that it's all about hate and dismissal. But if it were about dismissal, then we wouldn't need, or the people at the time wouldn't need to perform these plays and to create new versions of these plays over and over and over again. The fact that people went to see them again and again means that they were doing some kind of work. If it was simply reinforcing stereotypes, why did they need reinforcing? Even if that's all it was, we'd have to ask ourselves why they needed reinforcing. Was the notion of these stereotypes that fragile that they needed to be buttressed, or is there something else going on? Is there a way in which white society is attracted to what they perceive, wrongly for the most part, as a freedom of some sort, of some limited sort, that blacks had access to that whites did not, which of course is counterintuitive and yet seems to be an important part of the way that blackface minstrelsy works. So what is it that they were getting from these plays, and how are they negotiating this sense of race with those plays? The other thing that's important is also a negotiation of whiteness. One of the things that's happening in the 1820s, 30s, 40s is a greater influx of Irish, Scottish, and so on, these immigrants into large cultural centers like New York City. The Irish, when they first came to the U.S., were not considered part of white society, and that's another thing that's happening in the 1820s. This notion of whiteness being a matter of class, which is not entirely what it was, but a large part of what it was throughout most of the early history of the U.S. In the 1820s, in part because of industrialization, in part because of the influx of immigrants, in part because of the changes in the status of slavery, the whole notion of what is white, what constitutes whiteness, is up for grabs. And minstrelsy, it seems to me, didn't coincidentally arise in the 1820s. It arose in the late 1820s and 30s in order to answer this very question, or try to answer this very question. And of course, the 1830s, one last thing, is very important for the race relations in the early U.S. This is the age of the abolitionists, the rise of more and more concentrated abolitionist papers like The Liberator by William Lloyd Garrison. It's also the era of anti-abolitionist and anti-black riots in places like New York, and we'll come to that in a moment. Traditions of blackface performance go back to at least 1603, when Shakespeare's company premiered Othello, which of course featured an actor, a white actor, performing the Moor in blackface. Blackface, the mechanics of it are relatively simple. You take some burnt cork and you rub it along the exposed parts of your skin, mostly your hands and your face, in order to approximate the complexion of a black person. American blackface really arises in the late 1820s, primarily with performers like William Dixon, George Washington Dixon, and Thomas Dartmouth Rice, and we'll talk about both of them in just a moment. And this, we'll see that the tradition of blackface changes even with respect to just the face coloring, right? So at first, we're going to see that characters look more or less the same way that the Moor looked in Othello. The burnt cork is applied relatively evenly across the face. There are no exaggerated lips or exaggerated whiteness of the eyes. And that, of course, changes starting around 1843, and we'll talk about how that is and why that is. Now, it's a misconception that some people have that minstrelsy was started in the South. For the most part, that is not true. In fact, throughout most of its history, minstrelsy was not at all common in the South. Indeed, many southern states outlawed it because it was thought of as dangerous. It was thought of as finding enjoyment in the lives of black people. We, of course, think of it from our historical distance as purely denigrating black lives, and at this time, that's not the way that it was looked at least not potentially, that it could lead to insurrections, which is, of course, what the South feared, especially after the revolt in Haiti, where the slaves rose up and slew many of the masters and took over the island of Haiti. The South was paranoid, petrified really, that this could happen in the United States. So blackface was considered something that ought to be avoided in the South. So the centers of early minstrelsy production tended to be the frontier towns or working class neighborhoods in major cities like the 7th Ward in New York City, or the 4th Ward, also in New York City, which is the Bowery area. And we're going to be talking a lot about the Bowery area today, especially what is known as the 5 Points neighborhood. And that's this map that you're seeing now. It no longer looks that way when you go to New York City, when you go to this area today. It no longer looks this way, but you can see why it's called 5 Points, where Cross Street and Anthony Street and Orange Street intersect in such a way to create a 5 angled intersection. It's in this neighborhood that there's a relatively free mixing of lower class whites and free blacks. This is also an important immigrant neighborhood for Irish and Germans. It changes over the course of its history, so that the complexion, if you will, of the neighborhood shifts, but it's always an area of the lower class and therefore of greater racial mixing. This is also where several interracial couples lived, was in 5 Points, and so it becomes a focal point for some of the anti-black riots that occur in the 1830s. And part of this has to do with, as I said already, the history of the Irish in this country. Many of the blackface performers were Irish immigrants that were looking to get around their own sense of marginalization, and the power of blackface minstrelsy for them was that they can put on this mask and take it back off. That if you can play with this otherness, then it shows that what you are is something more flexible than that, something more harder to pin down, let's put it that way, than that. And this was a bid, in a sense, for whiteness. So here's a very famous painting of 5 points. It's by an anonymous painter. We don't know who it was. You can see it at the Metropolitan Museum. And it's a really interesting, I think, and revealing painting. You're looking at a cross section here of the 5 points that come together from the 3 streets. You can see there's a lot of bustling activity. You can see that there's many different races represented. There's a hog in the street that's eating some slop from the gutter, and there's just a lot of activity, right? There are people brawling, people fighting. There are people, it might be a little harder to see these kind of things, but there are people that are cavorting in various ways, perhaps flirting with each other. And then you can see in the center left, there is a man in a top hat and tails, right, with a walking stick. And he's obviously observing. This is very typical of the 19th century notion of the modern urban dweller. That's what the French call the flaneur. And the flaneur is somebody who is able to sort of weave his way, and it's almost always weave his way through a crowd and move along with the crowd, but not be absorbed in the crowd. So he's an onlooker, he's someone observing things, and yet he feels comfortable, he feels at home in these environments that are clearly not his neighborhood. Now, there are a few other things to notice here. You might see that there's a whole bunch of places, if you zoom in, a whole bunch of places that are listed as grocery stores. Clearly, grocery stores couldn't survive with that much competition so close by. Well, they're not all really grocery stores. Grocery was sometimes a euphemism or a front, so to speak, for houses of prostitution. And if you look very carefully in some of the upper windows, you'll see prostitutes, both white and black, waving to possible customers, trying to lure them into these houses of ill repute. So you can see that 5 Points obviously has a reputation for being somewhat rambunctious, being exciting. Obviously, it houses a lot of lower class people. It's an area where prostitution is readily available. And as we can see with our flaneur there, it's also an area where people come to engage in what they call slumming, to see what it's like, how the other half lives. And indeed, this becomes a very typical pastime for the upper middle class at this time. And here you can see a slumming party. There's a man with a woman on each arm, and they're being guided by an off-duty police officer. And a lot of off-duty police officers made extra money by conducting these slumming parties into working class and lower class neighborhoods. And so you can see there's some people there selling produce and so on. They're dressed poorly, and our much more finely dressed trio are observing them and taking a look. One of the moments actually in one of my favorite novelists' lives, Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, of course, is a British novelist. He came to the U.S. and he went to 5 Points. Along with, I believe it was Dean Howells, another an English, or rather an American author, William Dean Howells. I believe it was with him, but I can't remember for certain. And they were touring through 5 Points, and they just sort of blundered their way into somebody's house. And the guy, who was clearly living in a tenement, clearly living in this low-income housing, offered them tea. And Dickens was so moved that he said he became utterly ashamed, because he realized that part of the point of a slumming party is that you're looking at people as though they're exhibits, as though they're on display. But part of this in the 1820s is this growing divide between the lower and the middle class. And part of that has to do with the way that cities are operating, and really with the rise of industrial capitalism. Let's take a look at the next slide. This may be surprising. It ought to be. What you're looking at is still the neighborhood of Five Points in the early 20th century, actually. So this is a good bit after what we were talking about today. You can see behind the ramshackle buildings up front, you can see in the slight distance a tenement building. Five Points was among the first neighborhoods to have the 6-story walk-ups that many of us live in when we live in New York. And they were, of course, not air conditioned at the time, extremely hot, but you had a lot of people crowded in together, and so this was a way in which to save money, to have lower rents, not necessarily the greatest living conditions, but even worse perhaps were these shacks that still existed even in the early 20th century in this part of New York City. And we're not talking about Inwood or something way up north in Manhattan. We're talking about the lower section of Manhattan, what is now the Bowery area. You can see several of the windows are knocked out. These are not healthy environments. And so a lot of times what we're talking about are people who are consistently sick because they're exposed to various germs. They're not eating as well as they should. These are people that are just scraping to get by, and part of that has to do with some shifts that occur in the 1810s and 1820s as far as employment goes. We are seeing in these cities less and less skilled work. With the rise of industry, with the rise of factories, people aren't doing the apprenticeships that they used to find themselves involved in. So, for instance, if you were going to be a mechanic or if you were going to be a blacksmith, you would apprentice to a professional blacksmith or mechanic or whatever, and you would learn the trade. You'd probably live with them. You wouldn't get paid very much. You'd have to do a lot of the housework. It wasn't a great way to live for those 5 years, 7 years, whatever it was. But after that, you had a trade. You were trained to be a blacksmith or a mechanic or what have you, and then you start your own business. You get your own apprentices, and that's how you make your way in the world. Those are tradesmen. What's happening in the 18 teens and 20s, just as had happened in earlier decades in Britain, is you have more and more factories in these cities, and so you have more and more unskilled labor. Now, in one sense, that's a good thing. That means there are more jobs, right? But because you are unskilled, you're easily replaceable, you are not working in the greatest conditions, and people are working very long work days. We're not talking about 8-hour work days. We're talking about 12 to 15-hour work days where people are paid very little money and they live in conditions such as this. Here you can see another part of 5 Points, and once again you have this old ramshackle house that's in the midst of everything, and you can see a high-rise right behind it. So this is another one of these classic photos. This one, I believe, is from the very end of the 19th or the beginning of the 20th. I'm not absolutely sure. Now, another thing that we have, of course, in the Bowery, though, is not all just misery. One of the things that many people came to the Bowery for as part of those slummy parties sometimes and just for entertainment were all the bars and the saloons and the restaurants and so on that were there. And, of course, as we already mentioned, houses of prostitution. So 5 Points on the one hand, maybe not a great place to live, but just like the Bowery is today, there are lots of bars there, and there's a large nightlife, and that's what we'll see in the coming slides. This is from 1910, so this is almost a full century after the period that we're talking about, but it's a nice clear postcard that shows looking north from the Bowery, and you can see the elevated trains. This is before the subway system. This is when the trains were still elevated and so on. So let's talk about some of the entertainment that was to be had in the Bowery, aside from, say, slummy parties and houses of prostitution. You had three very important theaters at the time. You had the Bowery Theater, what I'm calling here the Old Bowery Theater, and you can see this from a postcard from the early 20th century. There was the Chatham Garden Theater, and then there was the Park Theater. These theaters, for the most part, catered to middle class to lower class audiences, and they had a variety of entertainments that were basically prior to vaudeville and that will lead to the minstrel show. But in the 1820s, they were kind of these variety theaters where you would have several different acts. Sometimes they would be loosely brought together into a kind of mini play, or sometimes they were a series of mini plays and then some concert type songs and so on. They were usually included some humor and some humorous songs, and then some sort of popular sentimental songs of the day and so on. One of the important forms of theatrical expression from the time would have been what's known as the Bowery Boy and Gal Theater, right? The boys and gals, spelled in this kind of strange way. These are Irish immigrants, mostly. The Irish, while they certainly didn't control this neighborhood, they controlled certain blocks of it, and the Irish were very active within the neighborhood. Some of them owned their own bars and pubs and so on, and that gave them a certain amount of power or pull within the neighborhood. And as many of you probably know, over the course of the 19th century and early 20th century, the Tammany Hall politics that were around the Irish immigrants was a major part of the New York political scene. Part of that was these sort of stereotypical figures, right? So here you can see the one guy, the boy, the Bowery Boy, dressed in butcher's clothes, right? He's his own proprietor. He's got his own business, and he's got this girl that he's in love with, and it's a dialect theater, and to a certain extent, while minstrelsy doesn't come directly out of it, it sort of develops alongside this element of theater. One of the earliest people that we know of to really make a success out of blackface performance is this man. This is George Washington Dixon, and this is a picture of him from around 1836. But it's by the end of 1829 that he's already on the scene in New York, gaining an audience. He may be the first actor and singer to rise to prominence as a blackface performer. He's working in circuses. He's working in these various theaters. And in 1829, he's playing at all three of the theaters that we're talking about right now, the Bowery, the Chatham Garden, and the Park Theater. And he's singing a song called Coal Black Rose. And this is a song that we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But it's not only a blackface song, it's a cross-dressing song. So he's dressing as a rather portly black woman who has two men interested in her. And part of the joke is that he doesn't try to disguise the fact that it's a man in women's clothing. And part of the joke is that she is a kind of masculine woman who's attracting these two men of very different characters, and we'll talk about this in a little more in a moment. He's the originator of the character known as Zip Coon, and he really makes this character wildly famous, and we're going to talk about what's important about that character in a moment. By the end of 29, he'd already expanded the song and a couple other songs, Coal Black Rose, the Zip Coon song. The other one that he does a lot is Long Tail Blue, and we'll talk about that one next. He expanded these into a sort of farcical play called Love in a Cloud, and we're going to see that Thomas Dartmouth Rice does very similar things. So the way that these guys seem to get started is they have some kind of signature song. For him, for Dixon at first it was Coal Black Rose, and they gain an audience this way. They play at all three of the theaters, really building their reputation, and then they build upon that. So it's sort of like having a hip-hop song now and then finding various ways to build on that song, right? Now, of course, you might make it into a video or have it be featured in a movie or whatever. With him and with Rice as well, the idea is that the song catches on and then you exploit it by making it into a larger play, expanding it out. And when I say a play, by the way, I'm really talking about playlets. I'm talking about very short theatrical pieces. So here's the sheet music for My Long Tail Blue. It's another one of the early songs that made Dixon famous. And you can see that it's building up to the Zip Coon character. The Zip Coon character is one of the two sort of archetypes of minstrelsy. There's more than two, really, but there are two that we really need to concentrate on and concern ourselves with. Now, if you listen to the episode 3 of my podcast, Sound Philosophy, you'll see I talk about the song in greater detail there. But let's take a look at a few of the lyrics that we have printed here. Some fellas have but one coat, and you can see that I've got two. I wear a jacket all the week, and Sunday my long tail blue. So the idea of the long tail blue is this long tail coat, and you can see the long tails there in the behind the fellow. And obviously it's meant to be blue. So this is a dandy figure, right? In other words, he's not that far from the flaneur that we were talking about before. And in fact, one thing that people don't talk about very much, but I think is significant with the Zip Coon character, is it's kind of a way to pillory the flaneur. Now, the flaneur is not a black archetype, it's a white archetype, right? And so a lot of what goes on in blackface minstrelsy isn't just poking fun at blacks, it's finding a way to poke fun at other whites and the pretensions of other whites or the desires of other whites filter through and put upon blacks. So there's a kind of a mirror trick that goes on with blackface minstrelsy. What you're doing is you're projecting out certain things that you maybe don't admire about yourself, or maybe you want to disavow in some way, you don't want to live up to, or you don't want to admit to, and you put that onto another character. So here we have the dandy. We have the guy that's more worried about the way that he's dressing than his social responsibilities and everything else. And the idea is that if you put that onto a black person, for I guess white figures in the 1820s, the idea is that just makes it all that much more ridiculous. Let's look at some more of the lyrics here. So Jim Crow is courting a white gal. So here you have a reference to miscegenation, the mixing of races sexually, right? Which is a big concern, obviously, in the progress of the social control of slavery, and I talk about that also in the podcast episode. Some folks call her Sue. I guess she backed the feller out and swung my long tail blue. Now notice that the long tail blue is now starting to take on kind of a phallic character, right? Swinging the long tail blue. And you can see that later, as he's going up Market Street, he hollers after her, and then the watchman, the guy that's watching over the neighborhood, took him up, means grabs a hold of him and spilt his long tail blue. In some versions, it's split his long tail blue. So a bit of violence there. Here's the sheet music for Cold Black Rose, and I'll briefly talk about this song. This song involves a kind of love triangle. So you have this woman that's meant to be, at least to the audience, somewhat unattractive, but she's got two people interested in her. One person is more of a country person, a suitor, and the other one is the dandy. So in other words, you have the Zip Coon character and you have the Jim Crow character, just like we saw in Long Tail Blue, where the Zip Coonish character, who is wearing the long tail blue, is complaining about Jim Crow being after the girl that he likes. And here you see a similar kind of thing. And part of the whole point of the song is that it acts out this kind of moment of violence where the Zip Coon character is hiding. Actually, it might be the Jim Crow character. I don't remember which one. One of them hides in a cupboard and then comes out. And in some versions, flour has spilled upon the person while he's hiding. And so when he comes out, he looks either like a ghost or perhaps like a white person. So there's all these plays on race. Obviously, because it's a cross-dressing figure, it plays on gender and plays on various social pretensions, right? The sort of working class person represented by Jim Crow in this case, and the more pretentious upper middle class person represented by and pilloried by the Zip Coon character. Here you see one of the most famous illustrations of Zip Coon. The song here is what we now think of as Turkey in the Straw. You sometimes hear it on ice cream trucks and so on. Again, you can hear a snippet of it on that web podcast episode. He's a character that's basically designed to mock free blacks, right? And this is important. We are talking about the North, where there are more free blacks. There were also a good amount of free blacks in the Middle South or the Upper South, so the Maryland and Delaware area. And so in the 1820s, this is becoming more and more prevalent. They're finding themselves concentrated in certain areas, certain neighborhoods, like the Five Points neighborhood. And so you have this proximity and ways of trying to understand otherness across this proximity. So he's a dandy. He's the flaneur in a sense. He's dressed in fancy clothes, but the idea is that they don't quite fit him correctly. We're supposed to see that this guy is all pretension without taste. Right? He speaks in an illiterate manner. He's given to malapropisms, meaning that he misuses language constantly, and that's part of the humor here, right? That he attempts to employ sophisticated vocabulary, and he consistently fails. The tune, as I said, is known as Turkey in the Straw, and it's still performed by bluegrass bands and ice cream trucks and so on. It's based on an Irish or maybe a Scottish folk ballad. It's somewhat ambiguous exactly where the song comes from. And it demonstrates an intersection between minstrelsy and the string band tradition that came out of British immigrant musical culture. So we're going to see a lot of these interweaving. So a lot of the songs that become famous through minstrelsy carry on into country music and into bluegrass and so on. So they don't necessarily disappear. They get cleaned up usually, so that any references to the N-word and other egregious racial language gets sponged from those songs, but they continue to play a role, and we can ignore them, of course, but I think we ignore these things to our detriment. I think it's important to understand where these things came from and how they changed. That doesn't make them bad songs now. If you enjoy playing Turkey in the Straw in a bluegrass band or something, that doesn't make it a bad song, even if it has a bad history. And we'll talk more about this as we go along. The other character, of course, is Jim Crow, and the person who made this character famous is Thomas Dartmouth Rice. He performs this song and dance number called Jim Crow, and it really ignites a craze for blackface performance in the 1830s. The dance is kind of a mixture of a kind of cakewalk dance and then what later becomes known as dancing juba, partly because there was a very famous black performer, not blackface, but black performer known as Juba who did these dances. Part of this has to do with culture in New York and other frontier towns. New York's not a frontier town, but other metropolises in the north. One of the things that happens in New York, especially in Long Island in the 1810s and so on, is on Sundays the slaves in New York have off. Now that doesn't happen as often in the South because the South is always worried about insurrection. But remember, there are fewer slaves per household in the North. There's less of a sense that insurrection is imminent. And so the slaves had off in Long Island on Sunday, and they would go downtown, whatever area of their village or wherever they were living, in order to try to make extra money. And one of the ways that they would make extra money was to dance. The local business owners realized that this was lucrative and that they were bringing in business to their establishment. So what they would do is the dancers would often carry around a board, and what they would do is they dance on the board, and then the board moves around, and it gives them both a stage, but it also makes the board hit against the pavement, making a kind of rhythmic, almost drum-like accompaniment to their dancing. And basically what T.D. Rice is doing is he's emulating this. And the other type of dance that I mentioned is a cakewalk, which has its own complicated history that I'll tell on the next slide. But as a character, Jim Crow is supposed to be lazy. He's usually rather sly about it, though. He can generally find clever ways to get out of work. The dance here, a type of athletic cakewalk, was supposedly inspired by a crippled ex-slave, named Jim Cuff. And at this point, Jim Cuff is working as a hostler, meaning he's a hostler. What he's doing is he's taking people's luggage from the docks to their hotels or wherever else. And I'll talk more about him in a moment. The notion of Jim Crow also partly derives from the folk concept of a dancing crow. This derives from when farmers would leave whiskey-soaked corn out in the fields, the crows would then get drunk on it, they become unable to fly, they kind of flop around, they wheel and jump, and the farmer could easily kill them. So this is another song that seems to have been adapted from an Irish folk melody. So here we have another picture of Thomas Rice as Jim Crow. Let me talk a little bit about the cakewalk, and then I want to point out something else that's important about this slide. So the cakewalk develops from a very old tradition in the South this time, where slaves would watch their masters dance, basically doing social dances of the late 17th and early 18th century. And then they would mimic those dances, right? And then whites would see them mimicking the dances, not realizing that that's what they were doing, not realizing that this is a parody of their own behavior. And then they would mimic the cakewalk dance, right? So the cakewalk actually develops out of a kind of second or third order mimicry, where the black slaves are watching the white masters dance a certain way. They're gently parodying that dance for their own entertainment. They're overseen by white people who don't understand what's going on, who then parody their dance, and that becomes the cakewalk. So all this kind of rich and contradictory history is exactly what Thomas Rice is drawing on, whether he realizes all of it or not. Another important thing to take note of here is notice that we don't have the exaggerated makeup that we're going to have in the later stage of minstrelsy. Yes, he's wearing cork. He's done up in blackface, and it's done in order to disguise his real identity. It's done in order to make fun of in various ways, or at least to borrow some kind of energy from the otherness of black people. But he doesn't have the exaggerated lips. He doesn't have the exaggerated eyes. He's not wearing the exaggerated wig that they'll wear later on. And this is important. It doesn't make it less racist necessarily, or maybe it makes it less racist to a certain extent or in a certain way of thinking. It's certainly not as exaggerated, but we want to talk about why that shifts in the 1840s, why we move from this form of still racist blackface minstrelsy to what happens in what I'm calling the second phase of blackface minstrelsy. The other thing to mention is Jim Cuff, who I already mentioned. I want to say one more thing about him. The story is often told that what Rice does is he's so taken with Jim Cuff's dancing that he actually pays Jim Cuff so he can take his clothes, right? So he's just basically taking Jim Cuff's dance moves and that he's using to make extra money, and he's putting it on the stage. And he starts off in the Ohio River Valley touring with this, and then he comes back to New York maybe as early as 1829. Certainly by the early 1830s he's in New York performing this, and that's when the craze begins. Here's one of the more famous pictures of Jim Crow. You can see this is another piece of sheet music. It says the original Jim Crow at the bottom. And part of that is because the song was so famous that there are a bunch of different versions of it, right? So you can easily find the wrong version or a later version of this song. T.D. Rice himself, as we'll see in a moment, he writes a whole bunch of different kinds of lyrics for this song, depending on his audience, depending on what he's trying to do, depending on the political atmosphere of the time. T.D. Rice and Dixon are both very complicated figures in a way. They're not the straightforward kind of opportunist, racist that we're going to see in the later phases of minstrelsy, especially in the late phase of minstrelsy where things really get off the rails. I'm not saying that what they're doing is in any way kind or is in any way meant to necessarily help black people directly, but there is a curiosity that I think both T.D. Rice and Dixon are evincing that tends to go away or that tends to shift as we move to later phases. And we're going to see that as we move forward. For instance, one of the things that T.D. Rice does is he creates his own version of Othello, right? And in his version, it all ends well. Othello realizes that he's making a mistake, and so everything winds up okay, and he winds up with a half raced baby, right? Half black, half white with Desdemona. Now, in one sense, that's shocking in the 1830s when he produces this, or it might have been the very beginning of the 1840s. Remember that the 1830s is a period of a concern, a backlash toward abolitionism, right? And certainly a backlash toward any threat of miscegenation, any threat of mixed race babies. That was considered a terrible possibility in the 1830s. And here you have T.D. Rice creating a play that not only is a happy reworking of Othello, but that it features as the sort of culmination of the entire thing the birth of a mixed race baby. Again, I'm not saying that any of this excuses anything. I'm saying that it makes it much more complicated than we often think. And that when we're talking about minstrelsy, I think that if what we do is we simply dismiss it all as being the same kind of ridiculous racism, we're not catching how it's doing the work that it's trying to do. In the 1830s, it's doing important work for whites. It's not benefiting blacks necessarily, although we're going to see something kind of interesting in a moment with views of blacks. But the shifts in later minstrelsy, I don't think we realize just how ugly they are if we don't realize where we began. Now, Rice, of course, goes on tour in England in the later 1830s, and this is what really makes minstrelsy our first theatrical export in the United States. It's the first type of theater that was really considered not simply derivative of British or European theater, but that is a form of American expression, and it catches on in the 1830s and 40s in England and in parts of Europe, and really becomes something that people are interested in. Now you can see here, this is another very complicated picture. You see the monkeys in the background with the parasol. One of them's dressed up in a Zip Coon fashion, right? You have all sorts of implications here that, again, I talk about more in the podcast episode. But just to hint at it briefly here, one of the debates at the time, and really throughout the history of slavery in the U.S., has to do with just what is the relationship between black people and white people? Are they both of the same species or of different species? And as ridiculous as that should sound to us now, this is something that people took very seriously. And again, I talk about this more in the podcast episode, but you can see that being played out a little bit in this version of the Jim Crow picture. Let's look at some of the lyrics. Here are some of the earliest lyrics, and let's get a sense of what they're all about. You can see that the main refrain is, "Come listen, all you gals and boys. I'm just from Tuckahoe. I'm going to sing a little song. My name's Jim Crow." So nothing too exciting there, right? The chorus then just describes the dance itself. "Wheel about and turn about and do just so. And every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow." But think of all the dance songs that come about in popular music after this, right? The song "The Twist" just basically describes how you do the twist. The Watusi describes how you do the Watusi. There are a lot of songs that are about dances and how to do them. But then the verses get a little more interesting. Let's take a look at them. "I went down to the river. I didn't mean to stay, but there were so many gals I couldn't get away. I'm a roarer on the fiddle, and down in old Virginia, I play the scientific like Master Paganini." So notice what's being said there. He's bragging, right? He went to the river and he wasn't going to stay there, but there's so many girls, and obviously they were all interested in him, so he couldn't get away. He's a roarer on the fiddle, which means that he's an excellent fiddle player, right? And he's so good in Virginia, he can even play classical music. That's what he means by the scientific. He can even play classical music just like Paganini, one of the great virtuosos of the 19th century. So you can see how he's building on this comparison with white culture and how he outdoes it. So this is a bragging song. Continuing on then. "I cut some money monkey shines, I dance the gallopade, and when I'm done I rest my head on shovel, hoe, or spade. I met Miss Dinah Scrub one day, I gave her such a a kiss, and then she turned and slapped my face and make a mighty fuss," right? So he's does well with the women, even if sometimes he's getting slapped, and he's able to get by even if he has to rest his head on a shovel, a hoe, or a spade. The other girls, they're going to fight. I tell them, wait a bit. I'll have them all just one by one. as I thought fit. I whip the lion of the west, I eat the alligator, I put more water in my mouth, and then could boil 10 loads of potatoes, right? So he's bragging here. In another version of the song, one that I'm going to talk about a bit on the podcast, there are all these references to the Battle of New Orleans, which ended the War of 1812. So at certain times, he's trying to make the song kind of about bragging, about showing how great he is, or how great this character is, who of course is just a stand-in for himself, right? We're not going to see this all the time in later minstrelsy, or at least not in this way, this kind of use of the minstrel character as a stand-in for the self, so that one can do what one would normally do, which is to brag about oneself and how great one is. But as we'll see in the podcast episode, there are also references to current or recent political events like the War or Battle of New Orleans. One of the most interesting and troubling, perhaps in some ways, but fascinating verses is one that he was singing for a while in the 1830s that you see here. Should they get to fighting, perhaps the blacks will rise, for their wish for freedom is shining in their eyes. And if the blacks should get free, I guess they'll see some bigger, and I shall consider it a bold stroke for them. I'm for freedom and for union altogether, although I'm a black man, the white is called my brother. Now, obviously, the when I said them, and there's the underline, it's the word that you would expect there. Again, that word is prevalent throughout minstrelsy, right? And there's no getting around it. It's meant to be an ugly word. It's meant to be derogatory and derisive. And yet at the same time, notice what this verse is doing. It's predicting a slave uprising, and really it's throwing in a bid for freedom alongside the blacks that he's singing about. He says, "I'm for freedom and for union." So he's not looking for he's not looking for anarchy. He's not looking for the end of the United States, right? He's not looking for simple revenge. He's looking for a way in which blacks and whites can live together. So here you have a very sort of strange moment that goes away in a lot of ways after the 1830s. And it's a complicated moment. I'm not trying to pretend that there's not racism still involved here, as you can see from the use of the N-word, if nothing else. What I'm trying to suggest is that at least at certain times, Rice is presenting, and it all depends on the audience that he's presenting it to. He's changing the character somewhat from audience to audience. But what he's after here is at least this vision of a kind of almost a working class solidarity. And that's an opportunity of the late 1820s and 1830s that then kind of goes away after 1837 and the Panic of 1837, the species crisis. And we'll talk about what I mean by that in just a moment. But for a brief period of time, the 1810s, 20s, and up to the mid-30s, you have this moment where it's not as clear whether or not the divide has to be white and black, simply put, or whether the divide is between upper class and lower class. And so there's a push, at least among certain people, for a certain amount of time, between a working class solidarity, that there is more in common for the working class white man with a free black man than there is with the people that are in charge, the people that are the capitalists. That moment goes away, and it goes away on purpose. It's a scheme for it to go away because it would have been dangerous for the capitalists, as we'll see. So let's see what the New York Tribune had to say about all this. This was written in 1855, so they're looking back from a purview of roughly 20 years back into the past in writing this. And by 1855, we're about halfway through the second phase of minstrelsy, which we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. They write, "It was this epoch that Mr. T.D. Rice made his debut in a dramatic sketch entitled Jim Crow, and from that moment everyone was doing just so, and continued doing just so for months, even years afterward. Never was there such an excitement in the musical or dramatic world. Nothing was talked of, nothing written of, and nothing dreamed of but Jim Crow. It seemed as though the entire population had been bitten by the tarantula." This is a reference to a belief that goes back to medieval Italy, that when you were bitten by a tarantula, tarantula, it would incite you to dance, and that the only way that you could cure yourself of the poison that the tarantula bite was through dancing. So you're both poisoned, but you're obviously stimulated to do this dance, which is the cure to the poison. In the parlor, in the kitchen, in the shop, and in the street, Jim Crow monopolized public attention. It must have been a species of insanity, though of a gentle and pleasing kind, right? And we're going to see this kind of language used throughout the history of popular music. This idea that popular music incites a kind of insanity, but it's a pleasant kind of insanity, at least for the people who enjoy it. But then we have the move out of this phase. And this is, even though we're going to say that the next phase really begins in the early 1840s, this is the political element behind it. In 1835, leading up to this, were the anti-abolitionist riots that really tore through the Five Points neighborhood, and they were throughout various cities in the North. This was one of the reasons that people said that race relations were actually worse in the North than in the South or in the Middle states, because really, as I said before, we have a tripartite stratification. In the North, what you have is people who are living next to, in especially lower class whites, are living in the same neighborhoods with black people, with free black people. You still have in the early 19th century some remnants of slavery in the North that's being phased out. So slavery is truly thought of as a peculiar institution, which is, of course, the famous way of referencing it in the North. And yet there's this concern, and I talk about this more in the podcast episode, but there's a concern with this goal of colonizing blacks, of having them leave. Of course, the free blacks don't feel that they have anything more in common with Africa than any of the poor whites do. So they don't want to go anywhere, and rightfully so. And you also have, of course, the competition for this unskilled labor that I mentioned before, these jobs that pretty much anyone can do. So you have a lot of rivalry, but you also have some fellow feelings, some sympathy here. And then you also have people who don't live in those neighborhoods, who have this fear of miscegenation, who have this fear of mixing, who fear this idea of blacks being more accepted. So there's a lot of tension in the North. That all gets a lot worse with the Panic of 1837. The basic issue of the Panic has to do with a couple of things. First and foremost, with the rise of the canals and the rise of the beginnings of railroads and so on, it's now much easier to get large supplies of cotton out to various buyers. And this is true of other crops as well. But the problem with cotton is there's really a surplus at this point of cotton, which makes the prices go down. And this leads to, and also, of course, in the early 1830s, you had a lot of land speculation, and you had a lot of investment in railroads and canals, including investment from Britain. Britain raises its interest rates, and that creates a snowball effect where the U.S. raises its interest rates. We're going to continue this on the next slide. Here, what you're seeing is this, the two people in blue are coming in, they're demanding their rent, they're demanding payment for various things. This guy is complaining about not being able to pay it because what happens in the U.S. is a run on species, meaning paper money loses its value, and if you want to buy land and if you want to pay back loans, they expect you to pay back in silver or gold. Now, a lot of people have cash money, and all of a sudden that cash money, the paper money, is plummeting. This was one of the fears about early capitalism in the United States, as it's becoming less and less tied to the land. As the U.S. is becoming less and less agrarian, you have more of the business operations running through paper money, running through credit, running through debt. And that means that you have the rise of what is known as wage slavery. And it's around this time that term gets coined, wage slavery. And there's even a debate, even at the time, whether wage slavery really is on par with actual slavery. And what are the differences and what are the similarities. And here you see this fellow, his wife saying, "Oh, it's okay if we don't necessarily eat." The children are saying, "Oh, I'm hungry," and this guy can't feed them because there's basically a run on the banks. This is the Panic of 1837. It leads to the Depression of the late 1830s and early 1840s. And what winds up happening is a change both in the way that people spend their money, the way that money is used, the way in which people feel about capitalism, right? This is one of the first major failures of capitalism in the U.S. A lot of people, especially the Republicans around the old form of the Democrat Republicans that were followers of Thomas Jefferson, they were already very suspicious of banks. They were very suspicious of capitalism in general, very suspicious of cities, and very suspicious of capitalists and their industrial businesses. And this eroded all that faith. So Jackson, who ironically enough got us into that mess, or got them into this mess because of him, he removed the charter for the Second National Bank, and that's part of what led to this crisis. And you can see how all this then changes race relations. It changes the way that theatrical entertainments work as well, and that's what we're going to talk about next. So moving into the 1840s, blackface minstrelsy is going to move into its second phase. And a lot of that has to do with the Chatham Theater in the Bowery. We've talked about the three big theaters in the Bowery, and one of them was the Chatham Theater. Now, what happens at the Chatham Theater is one of the pivotal moments in the history of blackface minstrelsy. And that has to do with these people. These are the Virginia minstrels, led by Dan Emmett, and they performed the first true minstrel show at Chatham Theater on January 31st of 1843. Now, what do I mean by the first minstrel show? We've been talking about minstrels all along, right? But for the most part, when we're talking about blackface minstrelsy in the first phase, we're not talking about an organized show. We're talking about a single song within a larger variety show, or we're talking about playlets like Love on a Cloud. That's a playlet. A lot of Thomas Rice's plays were playlets. They're little short plays. They can be anywhere from 12 minutes to half an hour or so, that are part of a larger evening basically a variety show. What the Virginia Minstrels are doing is they're really performing a concert, and it's a concert that's meant to last the entire evening. Now, there are other things to notice. I recognize that this is a kind of small slide, but even in its diminutive stature, you can tell that this is a very different approach to blackface makeup than we had with Thomas Rice or with George Washington Dixon. Even at this distance, you can see that the lips are very exaggerated. The eyes are meant to be extremely white. So you have the puffy deep red lips, and you have the white eyes. You also have the exaggerated wigs for the curly hair and so on. You also have these ridiculous gestures, even in this etching here, right? So you have the one fellow with his legs spread open, right? And that's Bones. So the end men, as they're going to be called, are Tambo and Bones. Tambo has the tambourine. Bones has those sticks, which are called the bones, that he's going to click. So they're the percussionists. Then you have Dan Emmett on the banjo there to the middle right, and on the middle left you have the violin player. And this becomes the classic minstrel ensemble. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to perform for an entire evening a bunch of different songs, some of which they wrote, some of which come from Irish and Scottish folk material that they're adapting, usually with by changing the lyrics to something racist and to them humorous. And they're also going to tell a bunch of jokes. So remember all the stuff we were talking about before with malapropisms and so on? They're going to use these as jokes, and this will expand to become a larger and larger full evening form of entertainment. So here we have Emmett in blackface, probably from around 1860. The Panic of 1837 that we were talking about, this leads to a decline in theater attendance, but concerts are still profitable. So people aren't going out to see plays anymore, but they are coming out to see concerts, in part because concerts are cheaper to put on. All you have to do is you have to pay those 4 people, right? And they have to pay the theater, whatever whatever the theater gets out of the deal, and that's it. Whereas a play, especially variety acts, you have a whole bunch of different people to pay. You've got the orchestra, you've got the stagehands, you've got all sorts of things that you don't need when it's just 4 people coming out and doing an evening's entertainment. In 1843, these 4 performers came out in blackface. There was Dan Emmett, who was on the fiddle. I think I said the banjo before. That was a mistake, obviously. Billy Whitlock on the banjo. Dick Pelham was the tambourine, and that character's gonna become known as Tambo. And then Frank Bauer on the bones. Notice, by the way, I was talking about the exaggerated gestures that they were making, and you saw the Tambo looked like he was going to punch right through the tambourine, right? Emmett or rather Whitlock on the banjo was holding it in a kind of phallic manner, right? So you have all these exaggerated gestures, exaggerated ways of performing. They first played together at Miss Brooks' boarding house at 37 Catherine Street in the Bowery, and then they drew crowds at Bartlett's Billiard Room in the Branch Hotel at 36 Bowery, and then at the Chatham Theater on January 31st. Then they had a run at the Bowery Amphitheater in February. So you can see that they're starting really just entertaining friends in their working class neighborhood, and they're building up to a whole show. They're credited, and especially Emmett is credited with songs such as Jimmy Crack Corn, which, people still sometimes sing as a sort of song that you sing with children and so on, and Old Dan Tucker, which is still around. Bruce Springsteen has a version of it. There are various other famous versions of it. It becomes a country standard, a bluegrass standard. And now the minstrel show is a complete evening's entertainment, and what you do is you sit in a semicircle, right? Here are just 4 people, and you play songs, you tell jokes, and you give stump speeches. We'll talk a little bit more about the stump speech in a moment, but basically it's a fake, actually I will talk about it now, it's a fake, usually political speech or some kind of memorandum type speech, where it's that kind of Zip Coonish speech where you're constantly using words inappropriately and making jokes seemingly unwittingly. They also introduced the characters of Tambo and Bones, and these are the M-Men, and they wind up being the ones that tell most of the jokes. Emmett also wrote Way Down South in Dixie in 1859, and as everyone knows, that becomes kind of an anthem for the South, right? It's still sung in the South at times. Becomes a signifier of the white South.